All right. Good morning and welcome back, everybody. I'm your natural English coach, Nagi, and it's time for this week's lesson. There we go. So, our word today is old school. So, this is an adjective. Two words that are one phrase. Old school. You probably know both these words, right? Old and school. But we're not talking about an old school. We're using this as an adjective to describe something else that is old school. So, can you think about what does this phrase mean? How would you use this phrase? Old school. It's a little bit tricky, but it's a very natural word that we use in English. So, old school basically means something that is from the past but still is sort of popular in some ways. So, for example, our first question, does a DVD feel old school to you? So, what feels old school depends on your age, right? So, for me, a DVD does not feel old school because I grew up with things like VHS that were even older than that. So, to me, a DVD does not feel old school. But if you're younger than me, a DVD might feel old school to you. Something that is older but is still popular or still useful in some way, right? The second question, is radio an old school form of entertainment? So for me, it's true. Radio has been around for a very long time, much older than me, realistically. But for a lot of people nowadays, radio is a very old school form of entertainment because there are other things like TV and the internet and YouTube and social media, right? There are other ways to listen to or watch stories. So not a lot of people use the radio nowadays. Maybe some people listen to podcasts or something like that. But I think for a lot of people, radio is an old school form of entertainment, right? Something that is older from the past, but is still interesting or useful. All right, so now we are going to check out our natural conversation. As usual, you will read first, I will wait for you, and then I will read I'll read the sentence, right? All right, so go ahead and read the first sentence in the red at the top. Okay. Check out this cassette tape player I found at a thrift store. Do you know what a cassette tape player is? Cassette tape player, you can search it on Google or something like that. It's basically, you've probably seen one before, or maybe if you're a little bit older like me, you've used them before. They're what they used to use before CDs, right? And you'll find a lot of them at thrift stores nowadays, or a store that you go to buy used goods, right? Okay, let's read the first blue line. Go ahead and read it now. Okay, so, wow, that feels very old school. It's got a nostalgic vibe to it. So we've got a couple of new words here. The verb that we use when we talk about something being old school is feel a lot of times. If something feels old school, the verb, feel, and the phrase old school go together. So now our second sentence there, it's got a nostalgic vibe to it. A vibe is kind of the same kind of thing as feeling, but it's a phrase you might hear some people use nowadays. It's kind of a popular phrase. So the word feeling and the word vibe are almost used the same way. Do you know the word nostalgic? Nostalgic. It's a word that you probably understand, but you might not know because it's a little bit difficult. But nostalgic is a adjective that means something that creates strong emotions or strong feelings from the past. So if you're nostalgic about something, you're thinking about something from the past and it's maybe making you happy or sad or something like that. You're remembering it, right? So if something's got a nostalgic vibe to it, it means it makes you think about the past. Okay, go ahead and read the bottom red, the third line. Okay, I know, right? The thrift store has a lot of retro stuff for sale. So now we've got that word retro. So retro is another word that is similar to old school. You might actually hear people use it one or the other because they can have very similar meanings and be used in similar ways. I would say that retro is most commonly used for clothes and electronics. So go ahead and read the last blue line down at the bottom. Okay. It's still in good condition, so it has a classic feel. But other people probably think cassette players are really dated. So we have two words here, classic and dated. So classic is another good natural phrase that you'll hear used in a similar way to retro or old school. But classic usually has a positive meaning to it. If you call something classic, it's meant in a good way, that you like the thing. And kind of in the opposite way, if you're talking about something that is dated, again, it means something that is older, but it usually has a negative meaning attached to it. So, for example, you can look at two different sentences. Here, let's go over to our document. These controls working. All right. So we can say, all right. So we have two sentences that are the same except for our two words right here. The top sentence, that car over there is really classic. And the bottom sentence, that car over there is really dated. So they're two sentences that basically mean almost the same thing, but in fact, they actually have two different intents. So in the top one, it's talking about the car in a positive way. The person who is speaking probably thinks the car looks really cool or interesting. And the person speaking on the bottom probably does not like the car very much and thinks that it's kind of lame or ugly or something like that. So even though these two words are talking about the same kind of quality, they actually have a kind of different meaning based on whether the speaker likes or dislikes the object. All right. Got it in one. All right. So now that we've read through the conversation once, let's take a closer look at some of these words. All right, so our first word here is retro. Retro. So go ahead and read the top sentence that you see here. Okay, things from the 80s and 90s are considered retro now. What does it mean when we say 80s or 90s? Well, maybe you've guessed or maybe you already know. For the 80s, let's do that. So the 80s equal the 1980s decade. And of course, the 90s is the 1990s. right? So it's a shorter way of talking about a particular decade in time, right? So if we want to talk about the period of time between 1980 and 1989, you can just say the 80s. Or if you want to talk about a time between 1990 and 1999, you can say the 90s. So for me, for example, I can say I grew up in the 90s, right? Or for other people, you could say I grew up in the 80s, the 70s. It's a little bit tricky once you get past the year 2000 because there's not really one term that everyone thinks is the correct term to talk about 2000 to 2010 or 2010 to 2020. There's a couple of different terms that you hear floating around, like some people will call this period, some people will call it the aughts because it comes from this OOs, the aughts. But not everyone understands or recognizes that term. There isn't really one easy term to express it, unfortunately, so good luck, younger people. All right, let's go back to our... All right, so go ahead and read the second sentence now on the bottom. Okay, that outfit you're wearing is super retro. So when somebody says this to you, it's generally meant to be a compliment. It depends on the person, but if someone is wearing something that is retro, it means that the clothes are generally from an older decade, maybe the 90s or the 80s. But a retro fashion is a unique sense of fashion, and some people really want to wear retro clothing because they think it looks really cool. You can find retro clothes in most clothing stores, secondhand clothing stores, used clothing stores, because a lot of people toss them away, but retro is a good phrase to know. All right, here we are back at our first phrase, old school. So go ahead and read the first sentence at the top. Okay. My dad writes letters by hand. He's very old school. So in this case, we're talking about an action, right? Your father's action of writing letters, not on the computer, but actually by hand, right? With a pencil or a pen on paper, and then maybe sending them through the mail. Not a lot of people do that nowadays because most people just use email or social media. So we could call the act of writing letters by hand, we can call that old school. We can say, oh, I'm doing it the old school way, right? All right, so the next one, go ahead and read the bottom sentence now. Okay. We don't have Wi-Fi service here. We're a little bit old school. So if you go to a place like maybe a hotel or a restaurant or some place, especially if it's like further out in the country away from the city, there might still be some places that do not have Wi-Fi service, but honestly nowadays it's actually pretty rare. In fact, I went camping this summer and in the middle of the woods, and there were still places that had Wi-Fi service in the middle of the woods. So honestly, it'd be pretty hard to find some place that did not completely have Wi-Fi service. But if they do, you can definitely call that place old school nowadays because it's not very common anymore. Okay, now we have our word classic. Classic. And this is a word to be careful of because you use the word in Japanese as well, klashiku, right? That's my bad attempt at it. But it's important to use the English pronunciation when you're speaking in English, right? Classic, right? Not chic, classic. So go ahead and read the first top sentence. Okay. I love classic cars. They're really expensive though. That's true. Usually when a car is 30, 40 years old and it's in really good condition, they're going to be very expensive because they are considered classic cars or old school cars. All right, go ahead and read the bottom sentence. Okay. As for video games, I enjoy the classics from the 1980s. So, did you notice here that when we use the word classic, we're not using it as an adjective, as we did before. We're using it as a noun, the classics, and specifically a general plural noun. If you're talking about the classics, generally you're talking about some piece of media or some amount of media that you consider a very important part of the past, right? So if we're talking about the classics of video games, it depends on how old you are and what you consider old for video games. But some people might talk about, Mario or Zelda or Final Fantasy or something like that. Those are games that everybody knows. They're games that are very popular still today. So we talk about them as the classics. But you can talk about the classics if you want to talk about movies or books or musical songs, stuff like that. If you talk about the classics, you're just talking about the group of things that are considered very popular and are older, right? All right, and now we have our word dated. Dated, right? So go ahead and read the top sentence. Okay. Some of the expressions my grandpa uses are a little dated. So generally, of course, each new generation and each new group of young people has their own expressions and phrases that they will use. And if you keep using them, sometimes they feel dated because they sound kind of lame or strange, or people don't really use them anymore, right? It happens with every generation, and there's many words that you probably heard or said a lot maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago that no one really ever uses now. Or if you hear somebody using them, you think, ooh, sounds a little bit dated, right? All right, go ahead and read the second sentence, the bottom one. Okay. References to popular movies become dated really quickly. So, I don't know if you notice it very much. It happens a lot, honestly, here in America where I live. But sometimes when a movie becomes very popular, sometimes people will make references to the movie, which means they will say a character's line or they will talk about a situation that happens in the movie as part of a joke or just trying to explain something else that happened in their lives. Again, it's a bit of an older thing now. I don't know how many of you remember The Matrix, but it's a very popular science fiction movie. But in the decade after it came out, and still today, it was one of the most popular movies of all time to make references about, to say the characters' lines, to talk about in other situations. But nowadays, I think fewer people will actually understand. All right, and our last couple of words, we talk about the vibe or the feel of something. So go ahead and read the first sentence. Okay. This new game has a real retro vibe to it. So as you can see, we actually use one of our previous new words and combined it with the word vibe. Basically, you can do this with pretty much any of the other words we've learned today. So you could say an old school vibe, a retro vibe, a classic vibe, a dated vibe. Basically, any adjective you can tack on to or connect to the word vibe to talk about a general kind of feeling, or this is sort of a complicated word to use, but an aesthetic. I'll probably stick with the word feeling. Now go ahead and read the second sentence below on the bottom. Okay. The company's newest car model has a classic feel that I like. So here again, if you want to, you can switch the word feel with the word vibe. They have the same meaning in this case. But the difference between them is that the word vibe is a bit more of a popular phrase that will probably feel dated in maybe a few years. Feel is a more neutral phrase and one that more people will understand. But for now, you can use either one. All right, so now let's try this conversation one more time. So again, you read first and then I will read after you. So go ahead and read the top red. Okay. Check out this cassette tape player I found at a thrift store. All right. Now here we go. You've got 3 blanks. Can you remember what the blanks are? I'll give you a little bit of extra time, okay? So go ahead and read the top blue. Okay, here we go. Wow, that feels very old school. It's got a nostalgic vibe to it. And here it is possible to use nostalgic feel instead of nostalgic vibe. That's also okay, although if you use the word feel twice and that close together, it might sound a little bit strange, but don't worry about it too much. Okay. Now go ahead and read the bottom red. Okay. I know, right? The thrift store has a lot of retro stuff for sale. Okay, and now our final last blue one. Go ahead and read it now. Okay. It's still in good condition, so it has a dated feel. But other people probably think cassette players are really... Oh, whoops. Sorry, I made a mistake. Let's try that one more time. It's still in good condition, so it has a classic feel. But other people probably think cassette players are really dated. There we go. That's better. Okay, so let's do some questions on your own. So I will ask the questions and you say your own answer, okay? Our first question is, what classic movies do you enjoy? Answer now. So for an answer, you could probably say, oh, I enjoy classic movies like The Matrix or Godzilla or, oh boy, these don't really feel classic, but honestly, they're probably pretty classic now. Like The Lion King, Lord of the Rings, stuff that's honestly about 20 or 25 years old now. Okay, our second question for you. What kind of retro things do you own? What's your answer? All right. So for me, it's easiest to say that I own a lot of retro video games from my past. So I own a Game Boy and Nintendo 64, stuff like that. I really like collecting old video games. But for other people, maybe they collect old CDs or maybe they collect old retro clothes or something like that. All right, third question. What's a place you know that has a good vibe? What's your answer? Okay. So in this case, we're talking about a place that has a good vibe. So maybe for you, it's a cafe, or maybe it's a particular place at your university, or maybe it's a place in a park, some place that makes you feel good or calm or energized, right? A place that has a good vibe. All right, fourth question. What do you do that's kind of old school? So remember how we had our sentence about my father writes letters by hand because he's kind of old school. What is something that you do that feels old school? Okay. So maybe you also maybe you write things down by hand, or maybe you try to learn to cook some traditional dishes. For me, I think maybe something that I do that's old school is that I don't like to use GPS. For me, I actually like to use maps and just try to figure out my directions by myself. I know it's probably kind of weird for some people who want to use GPS, but that's how it works for me. All right, so our fifth question. What expressions feel dated to you? All right. So every language, like I said, has expressions that become very popular, but then afterwards feel very dated and people don't really use them very much anymore, especially with words that are slang, right? So at least in English in America, I think the easiest example of these words are words that were used in the 1960s and 1970s, the 60s and the 70s, that are like hippie language, like groovy and stuff like that. If you use that, that is a pretty dated expression, although sometimes things that are dated can actually become popular again. All right, our last question. What's a song that has a timeless feel to it? All right. So again, in any country, in any culture, there are probably some songs that became really popular, and even if the songs are 20, 30, 40 years old, maybe even longer than that, people still love them because they're just good songs. You like them, right? That's what we call a timeless feel, a song that has a timeless feel. All right. So, last part of our lesson today is to review our previous lesson, which was on pronunciation. Do you remember what the focus was on? What were the sounds we were practicing our pronunciation for? So our two sounds were the L sound, L, and the the deep sound in the back of our throat, right? So let's see if you have been practicing and you can remember how to properly pronounce these sentences. So I will give you the number. You try and remember what the words are, and then I will say them afterwards, okay? So go ahead and try number 1. Okay, the answer is, I love to learn in class. Learn in class. Number 2. Okay, I saw the first light of day. The first light of day. Number 3. The girl runs really fast. That one's very tricky because you have that difficult word girl and the word really. You're changing from the R sound to the L sound. Really. All right, number 4. Okay. I drew the worst circle of all. The worst circle. And number 5. Okay. The girl turned quickly around. The girl turned. So if you still need more practice with these sounds, make sure to check out the previous lesson on L and You can find it on my channel. Okay, good job everybody. That is it for this week. So again, like I just said, you can find all of my past lessons right here on this channel and review them and pause and rewind as many times as you need to in order to practice. Also, please go ahead and like this video and share it if you would like to, and subscribe because all those things help me reach more people with my lessons. Also, if you have questions, you can go ahead and ask your question during the chat, and if I see it, I will respond to you. You can also leave a question in the comment section of the video, and I will respond to you there. All right, until next time, I'll see you then.